Welcome, everybody, to part one of the Chargers coaching search. We're going to break these up because there's so many different names that if we did them all, we'd be here till tomorrow probably. So we're going to break them up into different parts. We got part one. We're doing 5. So we got Mike Vrabel. We've got Steve Wilks, Ben Johnson, Dan Quinn, Aaron Glenn. We'll talk about all 5 of them. We're going to go in depth with all 5 of those guys. We will then do a part 2 with Harbaugh and everybody else. But today we're doing those 5. I know a lot of people want to hear about those 5, so we're going to start with those, and then we'll move on to part 2 when we get a chance. So before we do that, though, there's been some interviews already, but let's talk about just a quick little recap of the internal guys. So we know for the head coaching search, and we'll do GMs at another time too. So we're just talking about head coaches right now. Internally, they had an interview with Giff Smith, the interim head coach, and also the offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, for the head coaching vacancy. I know I don't really care about that. It feels like it's just a courtesy interview. But how do you guys feel about this interview and getting these guys in here to at least, pick their brain a little bit?
Let's call it what it is. It was an exit interview, and they threw him a bone and called it a job interview, a coaching interview. That's all it was. Neither one of those guys is really in consideration to be the Chargers head coach, but you can talk to them about what went wrong in the locker room, what went wrong with the coaching, where they think things can improve, and then you thank them and shake their hand and send them on their way.
Yep.
Absolutely feels like more of a courtesy thing than anything. Getting those guys in to really do a deep dive on what their perspectives were on what went wrong throughout the season. So definitely a good idea. So you know exactly what not to do moving forward. And I think, it shows them some respect. You're at least taking what they feel and their thoughts into consideration. But as far as what it means for them in an elevator role within the team, I think they took it seriously in that way. I'm not even certain, but I mean, it feels maybe as a coach looking to elevate and maybe have an opportunity at a head coaching position or a GM role. You just kind of have to be realistic with yourself, especially when you're listening to what the team has told you they want to do moving forward. So you really have a pretty good idea of whether or not you're actually in the running. But respect to those guys for doing their due diligence, and also, whatever lies in the future for the guys that were interviewed, best of luck to them, whether it's with the team or somewhere else.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't know that either of them have really earned a spot on another roster. I'm sure that somebody will see Kellen Moore and probably want to keep him. Giff Smith, I mean, he's kind of a lower rank coordinator. Somebody might pick him up too, but neither guy really proved that they not only deserved a role within the organization again, though Giff Smith did an admirable job at the end of the year, but couldn't get a win out of that team down the stretch. Kellen Moore, offense never really got off the ground since he's been here. And really, when you look at the landscape of this head coaching tenure, well, thank the Chargers for keeping Brandon Staley a one more year past that how they should have, because now we're looking at a head coaching landscape of some of the biggest headliners, including Harbaugh and Vrabel and now Bill Belichick and Pete Carroll. Now they really fell into a really, really sweet situation. And when you look at guys like Giff Smith and Kellen Moore, it's, hey, thanks for your time, courtesy interview, but there's no way in hell they're even close to top 10, top 15 of the people that they've at least requested for interviews. I mean, they've got to be at the bottom of that list.
Yeah, I mean, I could see Giff hanging on. He's been in the organization for a long time, so I could see him hanging on as like a defensive line coach or defensive run game coordinator or something on those lines. But, I mean, there's really no reason to hang on to Moore at this point. He's probably, I don't think he deserves it, but he's probably going to get a head coaching job somewhere. His name is popping up with Carolina again after he missed out on the job last time. It sounds like, Ben Johnson, who we're going to talk about, sounds like he might be the number one choice right now in Washington. So Carolina might lose out on him again. Mm-hmm. He actually turned Carolina down last time around because he wanted to stay with the Lions. So you don't see many guys turn down a head coaching job to stay a coordinator. It kind of tells you what he thought about that job and that situation. So
in hindsight, being 2020, man, did he make the right choice?
He was
sure
not
did.
wrong.
He dodged a
Wow.
bullet. So all right, we'll break down these 5. Of these 5 names that we're going to cover today, only one of them hasn't been linked to the Chargers yet. Not leaked, linked to the Chargers yet. There's been requests for a couple of these guys. One had an interview today, but first, the one that hasn't had a link to the Chargers yet is the former Titans head coach Mike Vrabel, who got fired by the Titans. He finished his career at Tennessee at 54-45. 2 playoff wins in 6 years, 3 playoff appearances, including a trip to the AFC Championship game in 2019. His last 2 seasons were his only seasons under 9 wins, which Vrabel, of course, achieved in his first 4 years with the Titans. He is gone. He was heavily linked to the Patriots for a very long time. Gerard Mayo gets that job. Vrabel now out in the open, and this is a man to put on the short list.
Yeah, he definitely should be on the short list. We'll get into numbers and where a little bit later, but I think, some things that I like about him, you talk about head coaches being flexible and being able to make adjustments. He made a big adjustment on the fly the year they went to the AFC Championship game. Marcus Mariota, who had been a former number 1 pick, was not playing well. He benched Mariota in favor of Ryan Tannehill, and Tannehill they strapped a jetpack to Tannehill, and he was off to the races and played very well for them for pretty much a solid 2 years. Was very, very good. Had career years, 2 years in a row. I think 1 year they were top 5 offensively in terms of passing and running. Very effective. So Vrabel is a guy who has shown the ability to be flexible and make personnel changes, which is something the Chargers have struggled with at times when people aren't performing. So that's a huge plus. Garrett mentioned the winning record, a guy who is going to instill a demanding winning culture. I mean, he won in college. He won in the NFL, I should say, when he was with New England. Played there for 15 years or something like that. Productive player. Went on to coach in college, had success there, and then made the jump to the NFL and has had success at every level he's coached at in the NFL. He is just a winner, and he knows how to build winning, physical, mentally tough teams, which is something the Chargers have struggled with. So I think those are really the biggest strong suits for Vrabel. Is the guy is just a really good coach. He's clearly a very good teacher. You hear his players talk about him. They absolutely love him. Derrick Henry seemed pissed that the Titans fired him. And I'm sure we'll get into why he got fired and some, potential questions or negatives about him. But, if you're looking for a guy who can be here for 10 or 15 years, build a winner, collaborate on personnel, and kind of take you to that next level, I think Vrabel should be near the top of that list.
Yeah, you had talked about Ryan Tannehill. I mean, he was the architect of revitalizing Ryan Tannehill's career, who was just kind of middling in Miami. He took Ryan Tannehill, Vrabel. They took the Titans to the playoffs 3 years in a row. And in that 4th year in 2022, the Titans were 7-3. And that was the year Tannehill went down with an injury. And then you had Malik Willis and Josh Dobbs lose 7 straight games to close out 2022. And then to start this year, they have a 35-year-old Ryan Tannehill now after multiple injuries on his last legs. They've got a rookie, Will Levis. They end up winning 6 games. I mean, it really feels like that he had everything right with Tannehill. Once he had a quarterback that was better than terrible, he took him to the playoffs and they were a number 1 seed. And then you get a lot of bad quarterbacks in the running, and then, of course, they kind of fell apart. But if you look at just how good and how much he elevated a guy like Ryan Tannehill, if you really think about if he were to become a Chargers head coach, the projection for Justin Herbert, I mean, it feels limitless with a guy like Mike Vrabel.
Yeah, he comes across as one of those real bedrock coaches. So kind of like Jamie mentioned, if he enters your building, he's not going anywhere for quite some time. He can end up being kind of one of those legacy type coaches. And I mean, there's another guy who not only has experience as a player, but also understands what it means to be a champ. So he brings that along with him. I love the fact that he's unafraid to be aggressive, and that's in any phase of the game, but especially in special teams. Like if he sees potential opening to deliver like a kill shot, he won't hesitate to risk to take it. But those shots are also very calculated. Doesn't feel super sporadic sometimes like Staley's did. But there's a flip side to that. So probably talk a little bit more about the opposite side of this later on. But when he walks through the door, he has like that instant like tough guy cachet. So all of that finesse crap that the Chargers are accustomed to goes right out of the window. And he brings in that mentality that they've lacked. So if you're looking for a coach who's going to come in and instill, again, toughness, someone who's going to put an emphasis on the run game, which is something that we all want the Chargers to do because it does wonders for a quarterback. I mean, look at what he did with the quarterbacks he's had. And that definitely aged Justin Herbert for sure. And when you're looking at like his record over 6 years, was he like 54-45? And that's with guys like Ryan Tannehill at the quarterback position and just doing like a really astounding job. Jamie spoke to this also with adjusting the change, like whether it was due to like in-game injuries, guys like Harold Landry going out or replacing struggling players or even having to deal with players being traded away unceremoniously like AJ Brown. Still finds a way to have the team be competitive, man. Regardless as to what level of talent they have that they tried out there on the field, they're going to be a tough out no matter what. And that's an invaluable trait to have in a head coach, someone who can lead men and influence them to compete no matter what it looks like around them.
And that I think that's an important point that you're making, Craig, about competing no matter what's going on around them, because you look at what they went through in 2022. I think they were the most injured team in the league. They lost their quarterback. Pretty much every starter at every key position was hurt. Their offensive line fell apart. They were a disaster, and they still finished 7-9 and played hard all the way to the end of the season. And then this year, they also had very little to play with, and they had 2 huge wins down the stretch against potential playoff teams, handing Miami and Jacksonville some pretty damaging losses down the stretch. So these are teams that his teams fight for him. They play hard, whether they're 10-6 or whether they're 5-11, and they play from bell to bell, week to week. They're not taking plays off. They're not taking quarters off. They're not taking halves off. They bust their asses. Now, there were roster issues there, and I think that's a lot of what drove Vrabel to get kind of sick of being in Tennessee and soured his relationship with his owner and with his general manager. And we can get into that here in a minute. But I think he had a very depleted roster. They did very little to revamp or rebuild that offensive line when it started to fall apart due to injuries and age. And they just didn't. They had 3 bad drafts in a row with a new general manager that just did nothing to replenish the roster. And I don't know that that's on. He took the blame, but I don't know that that's on Vrabel. It sounds like he didn't have a whole lot of say in some of the trades they made, some of the draft picks they made. And even though the word of the day in Tennessee is collaboration, it didn't sound like there was a whole lot of collaboration going on in the general manager hire with Rand Carthon, or in some of the trades they made, or in some of the players they asked to take pay cuts, some of their higher level players who they tried to squeeze and penny pinch before trading them away. It sounds like that stuff just really wore on Vrabel and eventually that pushed him to want out the door.
Yeah,
nothing
and right
about Vrabel's fit. No, sorry. Go ahead, Garrett.
No, go ahead, Craig.
I was gonna say nothing about Vrabel's face said collaborative the day that AJ Brown trade happened.
No,
he shot out of his seat and did a little walk around the room. Is what he did.
No, he cut his knee right from under him. So yeah, it feels like he wasn't set up to succeed moving forward, and they just kind of did whatever they wanted to, and completely undermined his ability to, yes, he is a successful head coach. He's done a lot, like turning like lemons into lemonade, but there's only so much your coach can do when you deplete talent like that. So it's unfortunate they put him in that situation, but at the end of the day, this is a quality head coach and they're nuts for letting him go.
Yeah. And I think, we've mentioned it through 3 head coaching cycles now, is that this head coach that comes in, hopefully the 4th time around will be a charm, is going to have to build a culture. And if you wanted to build a culture within this organization, Mike Vrabel's the type of guy that's going to do it. They've already touched on a lot of this stuff, but we haven't talked about just what a strong leader he was. I mean, being a player's coach, people fought for him. You talked about Derrick Henry. That's true. But what these guys were talking about. I mean, they really, when you go back and look at it, because I mean, just off the top of your head, you think about, big names like Derrick Henry and AJ Brown, and then on defense, Harold Landry, and maybe Kevin Byard. There's like a couple stars that come to mind, but when you really look at that 53 as a whole, they were roster deficient. And every year he made them competitive. Every year. They knocked out the Jaguars. They play for Mike Vrabel. Now, it hurt their draft stock, helped the Chargers, but these players play for Vrabel. And I think when you truly look it over during his tenure, it was always apparent that they shouldn't have been as good as they were. And that's because of the culture that Vrabel built. They should not have been the 1 seed that year. No way when you look at that roster. The way in which he built that team offensively, defensively, on all 3 phases, he is the kind of players coach that has that tough attitude. It seemed to turn maybe some players off, but for the majority, he's the coach that's going to consistently build these unique relationships with players that you want in head coach. And most importantly, he is a guy that's going to build an identity and a culture within this organization, which the Chargers need very, very badly. So we are going to talk about some good and some bad with all these guys. And I know we're talking a lot of good about Vrabel, but Jamie, you were kind of touching on a little bit. Let's talk about how we got fired and kind of the bad stuff with Tennessee.
So I think, and this is kind of good and bad, you get both sides of the coin, right? I think the question about Vrabel ultimately is, has his time in New England as a player, playing for Bill Belichick and seeing how that organization ran collaboratively and flawlessly, and they just basically got out of the way and let Belichick do his thing, has that given him unrealistic expectations for how it is everywhere else? He kind of became, and I don't blame him to a certain extent, he kind of became a malcontent. Not kind of. He became a malcontent at the end of his time in Tennessee. There was a banquet in New England when the Titans played Tennessee earlier this year, and he made a comment to the effect of, "I hope you appreciate how things are here. It's not like this everywhere else." And that's the kind of thing that's like, he's kind of taken thinly veiled shots at the organization that's paying him, that gave him a shot. Kind of makes you wonder what's going on with him. Obviously, he's frustrated, but he wanted input into who the GM was going to be when they hired Ran Carthon. He did not get that input, and that kind of started the downhill slide. I think what started it was AJ Brown, right? Trading away AJ Brown on draft day. That was the trigger. Mm-hmm. But from there, hiring Ran Carthon, not giving him a say in who the head coach and who the general manager was, I think really hurt the relationship with him and the owner. He apparently was very vocal that he did not think Ran Carthon was ready for the job when they hired him. And then they're going behind his back, going to some of his best players. They did it with Kevin Byard, trying to get him to take a pay cut, which is part of the business. But you trade away AJ Brown right before he's about to get paid. You go to Byard after paying him and try to get him to take a pay cut. For a guy who's used to being in an environment where everything is set up for the players to succeed, to start feeling like the owner is now cutting his legs out from under him by getting quote unquote cheap, it seems like it soured him really quickly, and you can understand it to a certain point. But again, it's kind of how the business works. So how is he going to handle adversity internally if things are not going the way he wants them to? Because things went bad fast and they got ugly. And you just kind of wonder how that plays out at the next stop, and if that's going to make people wary of him, and how his experience in New England kind of is leading to that mentality, if that makes sense.
It actually makes me wonder a little bit about whether or not this was a part of the plan to get him out of town. Doing these things behind your head coach's back seems, clearly it's counterproductive, but it doesn't lend itself towards him being, in the best of spirits where leadership is concerned. Or if you have that level of non-communication, I'm not sure how you expect any real success to happen. You get to a point of, we're going to do what we choose. You just go along for the ride and coach the players. It's not really the best relationship from a coach front office standpoint. And then that type of stuff seeps down into the locker room and then players and whatnot. So overall, I understand why he felt the way that he did. He did act out in certain instances, which isn't ideal, but I don't blame him for it. As far as some of the other issues that may arise that I feel like could potentially be drawbacks for him, it's really the same issue with any defensive coordinator. Honestly, if we're talking about where the Chargers are concerned and hiring another defensive minded head coach, it's the cost of success associated with that. Like any offensive coordinator that comes in that has a highly successful year with Herbert is probably going to be in high demand. So you're going to be cycling through them every year to 2 years. So we're talking about potential issues where Herbert's going to have to learn new systems again. And great quarterback, smart kid, but I mean, asking him to do that every couple of years, not really fair to him in his career. And as far as driving success for your team, I gave him credit for his in-game aggressiveness, but sometimes his decision-making can be a little quirky. See 2018 against the Chargers, where the Titans had an opportunity to tie the game and send it into OT, but he went for the win and crapped out. So he's not, again, to the level of Staley with making some of these questionable decisions, but every once in a while he'll make a decision that kind of makes you wonder a bit. And speaking again to offensive coordinators, he can't seem to hold an OC down very long. No fault of his own, really. These guys find success, and that's what they do. They leave. But, he had Matt LaFleur, Arthur Smith, and then that's unsuccessfully followed up with Todd Downing and Tim Kelly. So you're only going to hit on so many of these guys. So ultimately, as much as I like him, those are some of the drawbacks for me. And again, it's why I don't necessarily want a defensive-minded head coach. If they did go that route, he would be the selection for me. But still, he's top 3, but I wouldn't necessarily put him at 2. But still in that round for me.
Interesting. Yeah. One of the things while kind of researching Vrabel and his kind of coaching style, one thing that kind of stood out to me was the fact that he likes to use analytics in game situations, but he has openly criticized the NFL for leaning too much on the analytics and player evals, which, I mean, I get it to an extent, but when you look at his draft classes, I mean, they haven't really been all that strong as a head coach. I mean, I know that we know about the public clash with the front office and all that, but the first round picks that he's had the last few years have not been very impressive. Outside of Jeffrey Simmons, who was great, having Isaiah Wilson, Caleb Farley, Traylon Burke. I mean, those 3 have been very bad so far, especially the first 2. And I'm not pitting that all on Vrabel, but I think it's worth mentioning as a head coach and his kind of drafting philosophy. I think he finds some good stuff in this day 2, early day 3 range, but it just feels like those big swings in the first rounds of his drafts have not worked out recently.
I would just add the caveat there that I don't think he wanted to draft Traylon Burks. That was a follow-up to trading AJ Brown. So,
I mean, could be.
And I don't know how many of those picks are him versus the GM. It doesn't sound like that's a very collaborative environment. So, not to make excuses.
No, and that's what I'm saying. I'm not pinning that on him, but I think it's worth mentioning that he was in the room and he didn't get his way. Whether he had pulled that way or made that selection or not, I mean, it feels like the organization seems like a mess, to be quite honest with you. But his draft hasn't been very good recently. But the other thing that kind of concerns me, and I think we'll probably touch on it a lot, is defensive-minded head coach might not be the way to go. But the way in which he did run his offense through Derrick Henry, his run game has always been physical. And that's a huge plus. But it is kind of an outdated offensive philosophy. But I feel like it's great with the personnel he's got. The Chargers don't have that. I don't think he can run that offense the way in which he did in Tennessee through anybody the Chargers currently have. So he's going to have to bring another smart OC around. Craig mentioned Matt LaFleur, who's obviously coaching now, but it feels like a lot of people are making the connection that wherever Vrabel goes, Arthur Smith's going to go with him. So if you like Arthur Smith as a head coach, who knows? But as an OC, it feels like they're kind of tied to each other where he goes. So that's also something that would come along with Vrabel if he was a head coach.
So
I wanted to mention really quickly, as far as the offense is concerned, some of that's out of necessity. I mean, when you're talking about the quarterbacks he was trapped with, then, yeah, we're going to have to lean on the run game, and we definitely need to run and set up the pass when you're talking Ryan Tannehill. You don't want him dropping back 35 plus times a game. So it probably switches up a bit more so leaning to passing. I'm sure the running game is still going to be a huge portion of the offensive scheme, but you won't need to hand the ball off, 25 plus times a game with a quarterback like Herbert. So I'm sure that the offensive strategy is adjusted just a bit.
I mean, keep in mind too, how many wide receivers have they had in Tennessee? And how much of that is on him versus the GMs? I don't know. But AJ Brown's like the only legitimate wide receiver one I think they've had in his prime in the time that he's been there. So the offensive system, I think it, like Craig said, it was born out of necessity because of the lack of skill players. So there are strengths to it, though. That offensive system, you have to have multiple tight ends in order to be able to run that system. They have to be able to block. They have to be able to run routes and catch the ball. And they were highly successful with Jonnu Smith. And I forget who the other tight end was, but they've had some productive tight ends come through there, and they've developed productive tight ends. So that's a plus. You'd have to think that with Justin Herbert in his prime and a top 5 pick, you'd have to think he'd want to have a more explosive offense, because their offense was limited to what did Derrick Henry do that day when he was the head coach for pretty much the entire time. So you'd think he'd be looking for at least a little bit of a change, not to lose the physical running game, but to have a more explosive passing game that they can run off of play action because of the running game. So maybe, yeah, I wouldn't love having Arthur Smith as the offensive coordinator, but there are some pluses there in terms of what he does.
He has gone on record, Vrabel has, talking about how important a tough-nosed running back is to his system. He's talked about that running game over and over and over again. And I know you guys are saying out of necessity, but I really feel like that's within him. And you'd hope he would change. You'd hope, if you have a guy like Herbert, it's a totally different story. But I'm telling you, he said it multiple times. It was all, he wanted to run his offense through Henry for as long as he possibly could. But we'll see. Either way, I just don't think the Chargers would have anything to compete with what he wants to bring. He's going to have to revamp it.
And that's an issue that I think we're going to have with
a lot
not just Vrabel in terms of who they're talking to.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to the next one, to the man they have interviewed, and that is 49ers defensive coordinator Steve Wilks.
They interviewed him. He's not going to get the job. Let's move on. So Steve Wilks is a guy who's been a long time secondary coach, and he's been a defensive coordinator a couple times. Secondary coach for the Bears, for the Panthers, for the Chargers for 3 years, back to the Panthers, and now he's a defensive coordinator of the 49ers. He has built very productive, very efficient pass defenses pretty much everywhere he's been. He was in Chicago when they won the Super Bowl with Rex Grossman at quarterback. He has been with the Panthers twice. He's basically been attached at the hip to Ron Rivera for the majority of his career in Chicago, in San Diego, and in Carolina. Everywhere he goes, the defense gets better in terms of the passing attack, which is a big plus. He has had 2 in terms of wanting somebody with head coaching experience. He's had 2 tenures as a quote unquote head coach. One was as the head coach of the Cardinals in 2018 on a roster that was a complete disaster, that he had absolutely no opportunity to win with. 0 talent, no quarterback, no skill play. It was brutal. Absolutely awful. They threw him to the wolves, did nothing to help him. He got killed, and he was fired after 1 year, which really says more about how Arizona was running things at the time than it does about Steve Wilks. There is basically nothing you can take from that tenure as a head coach from Steve Wilks because of how little they did to help him. He is known for being a fantastic coach of defensive backs. To me, as I was studying him, what stood out to me was it feels like a higher talking to Steve Wilks, regardless of whether or not they hire him, is kind of a nod to how do we fix Derwin James, because everywhere he goes, he builds up the pass defense. Um, Probably the thing about him that stands out the most is his previous tenure in Carolina, where he took over a 1-4 team during the 2022 season. They were a complete disaster. They went through 3 defensive line coaches in one season. They fired Matt Rule after 5 games that year. They were having issues with play calling on offense. They were bottom tier basically in every offensive stat when he took over. They wound up going 6-6, and they had a chance to win the conference, or win the division, excuse me, the last week of the season. And he took a team that had no offense and had, at that point, Sam Darnold at quarterback, and took them from like bottom 5 defense to like middle of the pack defense in 12 weeks. The players raved about him. He was in a situation a lot like what Antonio Pierce is in Las Vegas right now. Players raved about him. He was the unanimous choice among the players to take over as the full-time head coach. He made it to the second round of interviews. They decided they wanted an offensive guru. I think they would have hired Ben Johnson had he not turned them down. They wind up going with Frank Reich, and now he's gone after a year. And what he did in Carolina with all of the upheaval, they've got a meddlesome owner who just can't keep his nose out of football operations business. Seems like they've got some disarray at GM. There's not a whole lot of talent there. They did not have a quarterback. They were down, at the time, they were down Baker Mayfield and PJ Walker, down to the QB3, and he still put together a competent offense. So that to me is more reflective of what he is as a head coach than anything we can take from his time as a defensive backs coach or what he did in Arizona.
Yeah, and I think that's a positive. I mean, even though he was strapped to a sinking ship, the fact that he's got some head coaching experience, I think, is good with both the Cardinals and Panthers. And the fact that he was not only got the defense up to top 10, like Jamie was talking about, he had a top 10 rushing attack at that point too. I mean, he really catapulted them, and they were bad on both sides under Rule. And Wilks flipped the script almost overnight, and they won 6 games in a row towards the end of the season and almost won the division, like Jamie was talking about. But it feels like he's a man who can make a little bit of something out of nothing, because even with the Cardinals, when you look at their roster, having Josh Rosen and Mike Glennon at quarterback, the fact that he got as many wins as he did is amazing. And he's a guy who really was dealt a really, really bad hand on both occasions. And that groundswell with the Panthers players, of course, Tepper sucks, so they didn't bring him on. They missed on Ben Johnson. They go all in on Frank Reich, and now the Panthers are in NFL hell, and quite honestly, they deserve it. And they're going to have to pay Reich for the next, 3 or 4 years now because of it. But not only just the head coaching experience, I think, is really good, but because of the long tenure, he's been able to coach under some of the best coaches. We were kind of texting back and forth about it, and they not only just some really good coaches, but some success during their biggest successful runs. He was with Norv with the Chargers under Ron Rivera, John Fox. Now he's with Kyle Shanahan. He is a guy who knows how a good staff is operated. He knows how it's operated and how it can succeed. And he's been on the sideline of some of the best offenses and defenses in the NFL over the years. So while he will not get the job, like Jamie said, right up top, if you wanted to talk to some of the bright minds in the NFL, Steve Wilks is your guy. If you want to pick the brain and get some of how you would improve this team and organization, this is your man. This is a guy who you take notes on, and I'm sure has some real wisdom to impart on the Spanoses during that interview today, because he is a very smart guy. I think he deserves a shot with the Chargers, or not with the Chargers, excuse me, with an NFL team as a head coach.
What?
Just not with the Chargers. Not with the Chargers, but he deserves it with somebody else.
His past the Chargers are benefiting now because I agree with Gary here. Of all of the interviews, this is probably one of the best to have because be able to pick his brain, have him speak to you from being a part of the best to the absolute bottom of the barrel. He can give you the entire spectrum. Understanding how organizations are supposed to be run, but then also the intricate details of specific defenses based on certain types of personnel. So yes, this is one of those defensive guys that you talk to and you ask questions about, well, why didn't our defensive scheme work? What were some of our tells? What guys were out of position? They could probably have talked to him for a couple of days and he'd been able to fix all of their issues, just walking them through everything that they did wrong. I like Steve Wilks, but I call him the king of the bad breaks because teams seem to use him as a bridge to their next coach, no matter where he goes. It's really unfortunate because they know that the guys are going to follow him and play hard for him, but they have no plans of keeping him around long term in head coaching positions. It's just something about Wilks that doesn't sit great with ownership, or they have their eyes squarely on different, more flashy type coaches, and they forget about the substance that he provides, which is really unfortunate because you have someone like this who can produce, who you can give crap to, and they can turn it around and at least make it look serviceable. And then you shoo them off to the side for the new flashy name or someone in college that, has no reason to get an NFL job and seems to fail up for some weird reason. But one of the things that I really like about him specifically on the defensive side of the ball, he runs an attacking style of defense and he champions creating turnovers. You look at the Niners and the way that they attack, they put offenses on their heels. They don't sit around and wait and be reactive. They are forcing the issues. Another really great thing about Wilks that apparently is a league-wide thing, and a lot of the players actually appreciate it. He's all about accountability and stressing the fundamentals. So for him, everything starts with the foundation, and then you work your way up. But until those things are right, you don't move forward. And he will keep you at, in park until you get those situated, and then you can progress. There's no pass and goal collecting $200 until you take care of the business at hand. So outside of that, also, lastly, placing a really high emphasis on player development. Does all this stuff sound really familiar? It's like the literal opposite of everything that the Chargers do. So again, this is why he was such a pivotal person in coming to the building and have a conversation with. Even if you have no designs on hiring him at all, the Chargers did themselves a huge service by bringing him in, and hopefully they took away something from it and they can use it moving forward.
So I think you guys made a couple really, really good points. And I've been talking about this in the Discord and on Twitter is this head coaching hire is so important for the Chargers, and they need to treat it like a fact-finding mission. It's not just about finding the next head coach. It's about talking to smart people and figuring out what have we been doing wrong? What can we do better? How did the defense fail? How did the offense fail? Gathering as much data as you can so you can then make smart assistant coaches and coordinator hires after you hire Jim Harbaugh. So I think I think Wilks is really the poster child for that strategy, because like you guys said, they can have him break down every aspect of that defense and he can tell them exactly what went wrong and where and who should be doing what and how to get guys in a better position to succeed. He's also adaptable. Craig mentioned that Wilks is a guy who runs an attacking defense, and that is true. He's always been a guy who favored the blitz and coming after the quarterback. But when he got to the Niners, he realized he didn't need to do that so much because of the front seven they have, because of the front four in particular. So he's backed off the blitz to some extent, to the point that some Niners fans would like to see him blitz more. He's not as aggressive as he has been because he has more talent and he doesn't have to be. So he adapts what he wants to do and how he wants to approach things based on the talent, which is such a novel concept. I can't believe nobody's thought of that before. It's amazing. So I think there are a lot of positives about Wilks, and he's a guy, I don't know if he'd be interested in this. He's moved around quite a bit. He's had a lot of 1-year tenures with previous coordinator and position coach jobs. So I don't know if he'd be interested in this, but if this is a guy who wants to climb to a head coaching job and he doesn't get one this cycle, maybe you approach him and say, hey, we want to make you DC, passing game coordinator, and associate head coach. And you can work with Jim Harbaugh and kind of intern and be his assistant head coach.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you have your coach in place to take that job when Harbaugh is ready to move on.
Like a succession plan, like a Gerard Mayo. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I hear. Yeah. And also, while we're mentioning all the like good coaches and systems that he's been a part of, not only can you tell the Chargers like what they could do right, he's been a part of some really bad organizations like the Panthers and Cardinals to know exactly what not to do and how to fix it. So there's also some good with the bad there. And what Craig was talking about, it is absolutely true. It felt like they wanted to bridge the gap with Wilks, and then they saw this shiny new Cliff Kingsbury, and they were like, oh, we've got to go over here and grab this new coordinator out of USC. This young guy, young mind, didn't work out. And then it was like, oh, we want Ben Johnson / Frank Reich, and didn't want to go where the players wanted to go. And both organizations went with the new shiny thing instead of going with the thing that was working when they had it. So we talked about all the good stuff. There's a lot of great things about Steve Wilks. Why don't you want Steve Wilks as head coach, Craig?
Another defensive head coach. Let's start there. This is going to be a trend here. But also, I can't say that I'm certain of what he wants to be offensively as far as an identity is concerned. Like, I saw what he was able to do with the Panthers. So he definitely is able to adapt, but I don't know whether or not he wants to be a run-oriented team that's more along the lines of like the Shanahan-esque system where they use the run to kind of set up those, use an outside zone to set up some of those deep shots. So not certain that I understand what he wants to be as far as the offensive side of the ball goes, and also who he's going to bring in to run that offense. So as far as relationships are concerned, I know he's worked with several staffs. There are a couple names there that, he could potentially bring in, but I think with a coach like Wilks, my biggest issue is going to be what you surround him with, because where I feel like the defense would be fine, it's the rest of the team. Well, not necessarily the special teams, because we know we have that on lock, but when you're talking about the offense and who you can bring in to help further Justin Herbert. And I don't know how close he is to someone who could take Herbert to that next level. And then you kind of got to remember, again, the cycling of the offensive coordinators if they are successful. So that's kind of my biggest con when it comes to Wilks. Other than that, there isn't a whole lot that I don't like about him. Honestly, I feel bad for the guy because he's ended up in some of the crappiest situations and been asked to turn them around and has done pretty well with what he's been given. So there's really not a whole lot not to like.
Yeah, I think him being a defensive coach and not knowing the offensive identity is a big deal. I think potentially cycling through more offensive coordinators would be a big deal. We don't know who his offensive coordinator would be. He's been in the league for a while, but he hasn't been on a team with outside of the 49ers with really good offensive coaching talent. So I'm not sure what his network looks like in terms of potential offensive coordinators. So that would be a big question that would have to be answered. And I think, he has head coaching experience, but he has 28 games of head coaching experience.
Mm-hmm.
What do we know about his clock management? What do we know about his game management? We've mentioned that he's capable of being adaptive and flexible with things during games and during seasons when things aren't going well. How's he going to handle the bright lights? How does hiring him help Justin Herbert? I don't know that there's enough of an offensive picture there to be able to say, yeah, this makes sense. And I can't see the Chargers walking into that situation again after what happened with Staley.
Yeah, what I think you guys are touching on is that there's just way too many unknowns with Wilks. It's, we know that he's a defensive-minded coach, but he has no track record with QBs. The QBs he's had have been terrible. So he's had, some awful stints as a head coach. But is that a chance the Chargers can take? I don't think so. Even with his impressive resume, he's been part of really good teams, but like under John Fox, he was a DB coach. He wasn't the DC. He was a secondary coach for the Chargers. he with Rivera in Carolina, he got promoted years later. So it was like 6 years later or something. And then he had a good year with Carolina as a defensive coordinator. He had a bad year with the Browns defense in 2019. He's now with the 49ers. He's been up and down even as a defensive coordinator. He's had some coaching opportunities, which is great. He's climbed up the ranks, but there's too many unknowns.
Too many unknowns and nothing really to sink your teeth into or hang your hat on.
Yeah.
Nothing concrete, nothing that sticks.
Yeah.
Not a large enough sample size to take anything really meaningful away.
For sure. All right, let's move on to number 3 from our part 1 series here, and it is the Lions offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson.
All right, so just some background stuff. 37 years old, super young. Dude's 3 years younger than me. It's weird saying that.
That's when you start getting old.
Yeah, it's crazy. When I read that, I'm like, oh God, what's happening? But
the players start to get older than you, and you're like, oh man, holy cow. But then when the coaches start getting younger than you, you're like, oh shit.
Yeah, it got scary during this process, by the way. I'm looking at some of these ages and I'm like, man, I'm just like, where did the last 5 years go? Okay, cool. Yeah. Whatever. So again, 37 years old, super young, but as far as a little bit about his background goes, just so everyone knows, in case you aren't really familiar with him, he played college football at UNC, University of North Carolina. He was a walk-on as a quarterback in 2004, so he has that experience. He was with Boston College for 3 years as an offensive grad assistant and a tight ends coach. He got hired by the Dolphins in 2012. He actually worked with now Bengals head coach Zach Taylor. So you see kind of the growth there and some of the minds that he's connected to, and you're seeing how the development took place. As far as what everyone loves about him, it's very clear. The guy's brilliant as a play caller. Like, what I really love about him the most is he's established play calling tendencies that he'll stay true to until he decides to take a shot, or they find themselves in like a gotta have a situation. And that's when he'll like completely mind screw opposing defensive coordinators, and he'll like break tendencies, but out of the same sets and actions. And then you've got either Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, Josh Reynolds, Jahmyr Gibbs, or random wide receiver of your choice running scot-free at the second or third level. So he's just really good at building plays on top of one another and utilizing his weapons properly. You're talking about a guy who Jared Goff is his quarterback. Now, Jared Goff's not a bad QB. But when you're looking at what he's been able to do with Goff here over the last 2 years, it's been a little mind-blowing because, for one, Goff's got a pop gun arm, and almost everything's based off of timing. But he understood that a strong running game is the best way to utilize a quarterback like this. So you're talking about a scheme that's also really run-based, but something that I also love about it is it makes aggressive interior defensive linemen think twice about quick gap penetration, because more often than not, they'll get ear hold on like trap plays. So he uses the running game so well that he makes Jared Goff look like almost an upper echelon quarterback. And if you take those ideas and you implement that into a system where you have a high level QB, imagine what could be done there. And not to go too far into it, because I could continue to talk about it, because after studying it for a while, I already liked him, but I didn't realize just how much I liked his offensive system. There are a bunch of things that you can take away from it and see how they could be used in the Chargers offense if they had the proper personnel. We'll probably talk about that in a sec. But just a couple of other things. He had the Lions 5th in points in his first year as OC last year. And now the Lions are 3rd in scoring this year. So you see the improvement there. And also listen to a couple of his pressers, because I wasn't really sure about him, from a leadership standpoint, because that's one of the questions that you have to ask about these first year guys. And he's really detail oriented and super hands-on. He actually referred to himself as a micromanager at one point, which could be a problem going forward, but it was him trying to establish trust with his coaching staff. So to kind of start off, he would probably need to be that way if he were to come to LA. And I would completely understand it once he builds the trust with the coaching staff. He can become a little bit more hands off. But another guy that preaches fundamentals and the importance of building a solid foundation. So, yeah, we're talking first year head coaches. That's not something I think any of us really want. But if you had to go with one, this is probably the guy to do it.
So I think Craig made a lot of really good points. There are some things about Ben Johnson that I really like after researching him. One is the players love him. They all, and it's not like a buddy kind of a love. It's like a, this guy knows his shit, and when he talks, I'm listening kind of a love. Like they all talk about how they respect the hell out of him because he puts in longer hours in the film room than anybody. He also trains and works out with these guys in the gym. So he is one of the guys, and he talks about coaching not being about him or about his scheme, but about being about the players. And I think those are really important points. I love what Craig said about the running game. Just to kind of add on to that, that is the most diverse, detail-oriented, physical, and creative running game I've seen in the NFL in a long time. They run everything. Duo, trap, counter, inside zone, outside zone, draw, sweep, reverse, everything. And the way that they do it is they build in different looks and motions and options for other running schemes into every play they run. Did I steal your thunder?
Yeah, keep going. Keep going.
And they go against tendencies. Craig talked about tendencies. They actually don't have a lot of tendencies because they'll pick 2 to 4 run schemes that they're going to focus on every week, and then it changes week to week based on the opponent. Imagine that. They don't just stick to one thing. And if something's not working in a game, they'll scrap it. They might scrap it for 2 or 3 weeks so they can redesign it and bring it back. And it's not just that he's a great play caller. It's that he is a great play designer. He has coached quarterbacks, tight ends, and wide receivers in the NFL before becoming an offensive coordinator. He has an intricate understanding of how the skill positions have to play together in order for the offense to succeed, which is something I think the Chargers have been lacking the last few years. The offensive linemen play at a very high level. The wide receivers and tight ends all block their asses off.
All of them.
They have complementary players in the backfield so that they can give different looks and attack defenses in a different way. They are multiple, they are versatile, creative, and just fun. And the passing game is equally as fun. The spacing, the formations, the personnel groupings, forcing matchups. They'll split 2 tight ends out wide and get their wide receivers in the slot to create matchups with linebackers. They get guys in position for yards after the catch. After they make plays up the seam, they attack the seams, they attack the middle of the field, they attack the flats, they go deep. And he revitalized Goff's career. I mean, when they traded for Goff, the assumption was, I mean, it was a joke. People were making fun of them for trading for him. And the assumption was they're going to take a quarterback in the first round next year. And here they are in the playoffs, having won their division, and they are, potentially headed for maybe a playoff win or 2. And he's been a big part of building that culture and designing that offense, which was a freaking disaster when Anthony Lynn was calling plays. So a lot of positives there.
One thing real quick, Garrett, I'm sorry. I just want to throw this in there. So something else that I noticed that was really fun. He'll come out in 12. So 1 running back, 2 tight ends, and they'll motion the running back out wide to create an empty look. And it's an automatic mismatch. So defenses will come out in base. He'll come out in 12, take the running back, motion him out, and now you've got a running back in the slot or out wide, wherever he goes, and you've got a linebacker lined up on him one-on-one. They actually did that against the Chargers. So, yay. But he's so maniacal in his play calling is the way that I look at it, because he'll create the mismatches just when you think you got it figured out. So if it's a play that they absolutely have to have, it's almost always going to be one on a mismatch. And he's going to find it almost every single time.
All right. So I'm chomping at the bit over here because this was my favorite research I did in these 5 guys that we just talked about, because you guys are talking about his creative play calling, even his maniacal play calling, and it feels like you guys are setting, and I can just spike this shit because when he took his job in 2021, he did an exit interview that I read about, and they talked about like his offensive philosophy and what he really wanted to focus on. And he said when he got here or got to Detroit, he wanted to focus on the run game with Jamal Williams. He wanted to lean on power and counter. But not only did he just want to lean on those two, he wanted to build off of it going into next season. It was like, yes, the season isn't going very good, but there's so many good things that we're doing right here that next year we're going to come out the gates firing. So in 2022, he built off that success. He ran multiple play sets, and you guys are talking about how many different looks they have. He ran counter. We're just talking about counter in 2022. They ran 26 different variations off of counter. Do you want to know how many the Chargers did in 2022? Looking back at the research,
3,
8 different looks on counter. They did 26. Think about the math here. And not only did he do that, so in 2022, he goes, this is working. And why don't we do it in 26 different variations? Sometimes we'll make it look like we're about to run counter, and then we'll run into we'll go play action and hit him with something over the top. But then he goes even further and goes above that number this year in 2023. He is not only just creative in his play design standpoint, but he's got one of the more effective offenses. It's not just, hey, this is all great. It looks great. Here's some eye candy. It looks good on paper. He's got the 11th ranked rushing offense, top 5. It was 11 last year. It's top 5 now. He's top 5 at explosive plays. He has completely skyrocketed this offense. It not only in his first year, but going every year since. And now he's got one of the top offenses. And he is just such a creative dude that, going back and reading an interview, he not only is he creative, but he said he always talks about he will take an idea from anybody, whether it's a special teams coach, anybody in the building. There was one time during this season in training camp, they were doing a joint practice with the Jacksonville Jaguars. During special teams period, one of the referees walked up to Ben Johnson and said, "I've got a play for you." And Ben Johnson goes, "What?" He goes, "I've got an offensive play for you." Ben Johnson pulled the ref aside, and they had a 5 to 7 minute conversation about this play. He went back to his office, put his touch on it, and they ran that play during the season. And he told the ref, "Hey, I'm going to run your play this week." And he ran it. So it doesn't matter where the plays come from. Ben Johnson will take it, make it his own. I don't know if the play was successful or not, but he told the story that after he got that play, he had to go and call the ref and be like, "Hey, I'm going to end up running your play. I put a little twist on it, but look for it." He wasn't reffing that game. He was kind of a hired ref, so he wasn't in the league. But how cool is that? A guy that not only is one of the smartest guys in the room, but doesn't feel like he's one of the smartest guys in the room, and will be able to take ideas from anywhere and be collaborative. That's, to me, I think is amazing. And not only just in the run game, he is a guy that just absolutely kills space. He is a space killer. Craig was talking about it. He not only does a lot of stuff out of run and play action, but he does so much heavy motion. Out of their heavy motion, they ended up finishing second in pass yards, second in explosive plays, going off that heavy motion. They build off that motion. They build off the diverse play sets. They get their players in space. This is just a very, very smart coordinator. And man, it was an amazing research project here with Ben Johnson. It was really a pleasure.
He'll find something that works. He'll beat the shit out of you with it, and he'll add to it. So he's like an anticipatory, predictive play caller where he's thinking ahead. He's like 3 steps ahead. He's going to run that counter until you stop it. And maybe you don't stop it, but eventually it's going to be a play action. Or eventually it might be counter action with a jet sweep or whatever it might be. Eventually he's going to hit you with a different look, and he's going to gash you with that look too. Then he's going to go back to that one because it works so well. I mean, and they get away from normal NFL tendencies. They run away from extra people. They don't necessarily rely on numbers to run the ball.
Mhm.
They'll run away from motion. They'll run to the short side of the field instead of the wide side of the field on plays that traditionally call for running to the field side. It's like he's just kind of treating that defense like a yo-yo, and he's throwing it out there and reeling you back in, and he just keeps throwing that hook out there. What's that?
He toys with defenses.
Yeah, he does.
And then he, to boot, does this to the Chargers, where they ran that play the Jacksonville ran to win the game in the playoffs, that trap run play. They did it against the Chargers to seal the win against the Chargers this year. So
no, I'm sorry. This is ridiculously impressive to me. As an interior defensive lineman, like I watched at least 3 games where you could see guys getting upfield as fast as they could to attack the run. And after they got smacked in trap a few times, they would hesitate. And then in the hesitation, it just creates open lanes other places. But then also it eliminates the pass rush when Goff drops back in play action. Defensive linemen from being aggressive and getting upfield with the running game. So the dude is a freaking maniac. Seriously, he's amazing at what he does. And again, I have a different appreciation for him as an offensive mind after having studied him for the last 4 or 5 days. But man, you talk about a guy who can put it all together against really any defense, and there he is.
He, in some ways, his running game reminds me of the Ravens running game, where it just seems like he's creating chaos up front. Different looks, different blocking schemes, just like Craig said, kind of daring the defensive lineman to come up the field and get smacked, drawing them in, punishing them for taking the bait. It's a thing of beauty. The question is, can they execute his offense?
So as we transition here, Nick in the chat, dudes, you guys are selling me on Ben Johnson. Kevin, I know, right? Making me want to move him up in front of Vrabel. So we've been gushing about Ben Johnson. Jamie, why are you a little down on Ben Johnson?
Well, obviously the big one, no head coaching experience. And he is a fantastic play caller, but there have been plenty of play callers and play designers who have failed as head coaches because it's just a different skill set. It requires a whole different level of organization. Craig mentioned earlier that he is super detailed, and this is a positive and a negative. He self-assesses constantly. He talks all the time about, I'll go back and look at something and try to figure out why it doesn't work. I'll dress it up. I'll make it better. We'll come back and we'll run it a couple weeks later. That's a positive. But he is so detailed and so thorough. Players talk about how he's down like extremely intricate when he's breaking a play down and teaching a play. After what they just went through with Staley, who tried to build rules and laws and guidelines into every single aspect of the defense, he could give some Brandon Staley vibes in terms of being an over teacher. That is a concern, probably a minor concern, but it's just a question of how the Chargers players are going to accept that after what they just went through with Staley. And I would say I had another negative and I lost it.
We can pile on if you want.
Why don't you guys go and I'll circle back.
Yeah, and Craig mentioned, I mean, a first-time head coach, that's a big thing. But another thing, just to keep in mind here, is that the rumor is that Ben Johnson wants $15 million per year to be a head coach. And let me say off the top, money should not be an issue for the Spanos during this coaching cycle. That should not stop them from hiring anybody. But that's a lot of money for a first-year head coach. That's more money than that's the exact same range that Sean McVay's in. He's above, that would be above guys like Andy Reid and Mike Tomlin and Kyle Shanahan and John Harbaugh. He'd be tied for the third highest paid coach as he walks through the door without having a minute as a head coach in the NFL. there is a possibility that the Chargers could get in like a Frank Reich situation where they got to pay this guy a ton of money because it might not work. We don't know how good of a head coach this guy could be. Brilliant play caller, not a lot of head coaching experience, not a lot of coaching experience in general. Tight end coach in Boston College, got hired to work on as a wide receiver coach with the Dolphins, went to the Lions, worked his way up to offensive coordinator, was offensive coordinator now for a couple of years. But outside of that, he's pretty green in terms of his experience in the NFL, especially considering all the other guys that they're interviewing. He's probably one of the most green coordinators that they're going to interview. So, I just for a little bit of perspective, Ben Johnson has less coaching experience than Staley did when he was hired. So the unknown there is scary. That's all I'm saying. Should they shell out money for a guy like Ben Johnson if a lot of the guys don't end up working? Abso-fucking-lutely. But I'm just saying there's some unknown there. It's a lot of money, and that to me could be a negative if it doesn't work out.
Yeah, the other negative that I was going to throw out there, and we've already kind of alluded to it, and we talked about it with Vrabel. Can the Chargers execute his scheme the way he wants to run it? I have serious questions about whether or not the Chargers are capable of executing all of the looks and run schemes in particular that he runs. How are they going to respond to that level of teaching? How are they going to respond to running something so diverse and complicated? It just is. It's complicated, and Staley's defense was complicated. They couldn't figure it out, and I realize it's two different sides of the ball, but how are they going to respond to that level of teaching? How are they going to respond to that level of detail? And do they have the personnel to do it? I mean, Johnson stepped into a situation, granted it was Jared Goff, but he had the quarterback. The Chargers have the quarterback. They basically had the offensive line put together. They just added Penei Sewell to it. The Chargers do not have the offensive line put together right now. The Chargers their skill position players are in major flux. They have, I think, one running back signed for next year. They have Keenan and Palmer really, and QJ at wide receiver. They have no tight ends really going into next year. Do they have the personnel to carry that scheme out? I don't know that they do. And it's not as ready-made a situation where they could just add 2 or 3 pieces to the Detroit defense and make it that much better. That's not the situation the Chargers are in. So are they able to build that and carry out the scheme? I don't know. I don't know the answer, but it's a legitimate concern.
And to piggyback off of that a little bit, when you're talking about not having those pieces that you can add to kind of complete the puzzle, it's one of the reasons why they were able to go after Sam Laporta and Jahmyr Gibbs in this last draft cycle, because they had a bunch of the other positions taken care of. So it added to the offense and made it much easier to run. Chargers have so many question marks right now offensively that he may have to run some sort of toned down version of this offense. So you're not going to see it at its full capabilities. Another one of my concerns is like, yes, he's a first-year head coach. So then you have to ask yourself a question. Will he be able to successfully navigate through like everything that's going on around him? Plus whatever turnover the roster will experience and keep them like relatively competitive, or will 24 end up being a gap year? So, you've got that along with who else is coming with him staff wise. I'm not sure. Have to kind of, I don't know if you guys were able to look into any of that. I'm not sure about many of his relationships. I have to look a little bit further. But another thing that kind of threw me off just a bit, and Jamie, you mentioned that the players love him. Strangely enough, he wasn't rated in the top 5 among players voting for the top coordinator. So there were votes for the top coordinators in the league, and he wasn't amongst the top 5. Someone else that we're going to talk about is, but Ben was missing from there. And I know that the players actually like him as well, but made me wonder if it's more of a respect thing as opposed to, hey, we really like that guy. If he wasn't a coach, we go out and have like a beer with him or something like that. So, yeah.
You know, what's interesting though is the other guy we're going to talk about his unit has not performed at all in his tenure in Detroit. So it might just be that he's a good guy and he's not holding anybody accountable and they feel comfortable with him. And it sounds like Johnson is more demanding and more detailed and more of a coach. And they may just not they respect him and they like working for him, but they're not, they don't respond to him the way they do the other guy, because that ranking makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
Kellen Moore was up there.
Yeah, that makes no sense. The guy we're talking about is Aaron Glenn, and based on the performance of that defense, there's no reason he should be in the top 5 among coordinators. So I don't get it. So it's got to be like a personality thing and I want to go drinking with this guy thing, as opposed to we'll fight for this guy. It's just very weird. So what a great segue.
Yeah,
right?
perfect segue, because now we're moving on. Lions DC, Aaron Glenn.
another dud who's not going to get hired.
So
go ahead.
I'll set you up. I'll give you a little backstory on you. Glenn's a former player, took on a GM role with an indoor football team. It was the Houston Stallions. Then became a personnel scout with the Jets. Moved to coaching in 2014. He was a DB coach with Cleveland. Did the same with New Orleans before getting the DC job with Detroit in 2021. In his first year, he inherited a team that was pretty much in transition under Dan Campbell. Finished with a bottom 5 defense. Next season, they got worst, finished dead last that season. And then now they jumped up to 16, which is an improvement, but still a middle of the road defense. So a guy with some experience, but not a ton of success.
Yeah, so I was actually disappointed. I've heard a lot of good things about Glenn. He's somebody who's been hot in the last couple of coaching cycles. He was somebody I was excited to dig into, and I just didn't really find anything to grab onto.
This is the good part. This is where we're supposed to say something good.
Okay.
Craig, I'm sure Craig's got some stuff. You probably know Aaron Glenn, right, Craig?
Don't put that evil on me, Garrett.
He's from New Orleans, Texas. You don't know him?
He's from Texas, and I'm familiar with some of the same players that he coached. Yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay. All right.
So positives. He was a longtime NFL player. I believe he was a return specialist as well. Highly productive, 3-time Pro Bowler on the field, 41 career interceptions. The guy knows the secondary. He knows how to play the secondary. There are some things that suggest he knows how to coach the secondary, although those things haven't necessarily carried over in Detroit. He had a lot of success with the Browns in 2019 as the secondary coach. A lot of talent there. They had Joe Hayden. They had Dante Whitner. They had who was the other safety? I'm drawing the blank now. Tayshaun Gibson, a longtime favorite of the show. And those guys forced a lot of turnovers. He develops aggressive, ball hawking, playmaking, versatile secondary players, guys who can move around, play multiple positions. They attack, they come downhill, they get tackles for loss, they'll get to the quarterback, and they'll force turnovers. Those are the positives. He was also very successful in I think 3-year stint with New Orleans, if I'm not mistaken, 2 or 3-year stint, where he had another very talented group. Marshawn Lattimore, he's a guy Glenn helped bring him along early in his career. Former top 5 pick, very talented corner. Somebody who played very well for Glenn as a playmaker in that secondary. Marcus Williams, a guy who we liked coming out in the draft when he came out of Utah. He helped develop him as a safety, ultimately helped him get paid a couple off seasons ago. And also Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, somebody else that we really loved coming out of the draft. Got him in the 3rd round, coached him up, made him a very versatile slot/safety defender, playmaker. A lot of success forcing turnovers and just making plays for the defense. He's a guy who I think is very respected. I like even though it was 1 year, I like the stint as a front office guy in an indoor football league. I also like that he got some experience as a scout for the Jets. So he's got some front office, some player personnel experience. He's got some player developing and some position coach experience. And that takes us into his time as a defensive coordinator for the Lions, which here, and it's going to end our good portion of this talk. So I'll let the guys jump in with their positives, and then we can talk about the negatives.
Greg.
Jamie kind of covered all the bases, but what I will say is that as far as like the run defense goes, it went from third worst in 2022 to second best this year. Um, it's the run defense. So he's more of a secondary guy, but he's still a DC. So you have to give him some credit for that. Yeah, the early experience as a personnel scout is really good because he's pretty good at identifying talent and developing it. And he has intimate understanding of the secondary and coverages, so he can really help to diagnose and defend route combinations. Believe it or not, the name that I got, or what the guys referred to him as, a couple of people I've talked to, is, believe it or not, leader of men. So I'm not exactly sure how to take that, because from what I was told, he does hold guys accountable. He's not necessarily super tough on them, but he's relatable because he played. So he knows how to talk to the guys, and he can get them to play at a high level because he knows what buttons to press. So he doesn't necessarily have to be, tough on them per se. He can speak to them in a way to get them motivated to play at their very best because he knows how to, because he's been there. Now, that brings me back to what we talked about when we were, going through Ben Johnson. He received the most votes of any coordinator in the NFL as far as the most liked coordinator in the league. So this is another one of those. He's one of the guys. He's very charismatic. Everyone who comes into contact with him, I've not heard a negative thing. Of all the people that I talked to that either played under him or are linked to people who played under him, no one has a negative thing to say. And I think it's just kind of what Jamie spoke to. It's probably more so based upon his personality and the way that he can relate to those guys. And he does hold them accountable, but he has a very charismatic way of going about it. Whereas Ben Johnson is probably just more straight and to the point. And I'm not necessarily calling him a drill sergeant, but someone who is a stickler for the details and probably a little bit more rigid. But yeah, other than that, man, that's kind of all I got, because as far as putting like a solid resume together for actual results, I mean, he's only been a DC now for 2 years, so it's not a whole lot to draw from that. And, could he be someone in the future that could have more of a solid, I guess something to go to bat to make him feel like a guy that can potentially lead a team overall? Yeah, maybe in a couple years, but he does give me that vibe of more of a CEO. So he probably could manage a team overall and then, just kind of work with his various coordinators and find some success in that way, because he gives a little bit. And here's another name that came up, Mike Tomlin. Some people have said to me that he reminds them of Mike Tomlin, and that's another CEO coach. So yeah, we could be shortchanging him a bit, but also the resume is what it is, and that's all we have to go off of at this point. So,
yeah, I think the good is that he's literally seen it from every angle. He was a former player, even though it's an indoor team. He was a GM, but he's still a personnel scout with the Jets. Now he's a coordinator. I mean, he's been through it all. So there is some experience there. He's seen it from multiple sides. So if you're interviewing a guy and you want to get an outside perspective on the Chargers roster, Glenn could be another guy that you could get a different perspective from. Have you guys watched Hard Knocks?
No.
Did you guys watch it with the Lions?
Oh,
Nope.
wait.
When they were Lions?
I think I did. This is the one where Jared Goff's wife was on there, and yeah.
No, that was
was that Rams? Was that Rams?
that was
or
Rams.
Lions?
Yeah, that was Rams.
Rams. Okay. I thought that
So
was
the
Lions.
other thing positive, and I'll play a little clip, it'll be fun, is that I watched Hard Knocks with the Lions, and it was a lot of fun. And he is a competitor as a coach. He is fiery. Him and Deuce Staley, who is the assistant head coach, and I think run game coordinator, those two went at it every practice. And so here's just a little look on Aaron Glenn and what he looks like during practice.
He know his own. Ain't no need to even talk about it.
Why you circling me, though?
I'm sorry. Huh?
Why you circling me?
That's what the vultures do. they just keep circling.
I truly love him,
Yes, love.
but I want to him up between the lines. I'm going to tell you straight up.
Yeah, AG and start right here, baby.
And dudes, you're absolutely right.
Ain't no doubt.
You want something, we're going to give you something.
Yeah, well, we're going to take it.
We want something, we're going to give you something. We're going to give you everything you want. Let's go, man, compete. I'll compete them. Now talk.
Stop the screen.
5-yard
Stop
route.
the screen. Oh,
You have
great,
one of
stop the
5-yard
screen.
route.
Great, stop the screen.
You want to talk
I'm happy for you.
5-yard route.
I'm happy for you.
You should be.
Yeah, you stop the screen. I ain't heard you
Hey,
all
bang it out.
Now you woke up. You forgot to tell them we playing today. You forgot to tell them we playing today.
Man, y'all had
They look
one play and now you
scared.
want to talk.
They look scared.
Oh, that's great. I love that. Big
How do you not love
personality.
that as a player? That's-
I know. That's awesome. You love that. All right, so that's a good little cherry on top for the good stuff. Jamie, you already wanted to get into it, so let's talk about the bad stuff.
I'm going to add one more positive because I feel
Yes.
bad. One thing that I did read about him is that he has been kind of obviously a mentee with Dan Campbell, and Campbell has basically been mentoring him for a head coaching job. They collaborate on game plan. They meet after the game to talk about situational stuff, game management stuff, all that kind of stuff. And he's been getting a lot of training on how to talk to GMs, how to talk to scouts, and obviously he knows how to deal with the players. So I think those are positive in terms of, like Craig said, that CEO kind of feel where he just knows how to deal with everybody and can kind of move the pieces around as he needs to. So that's my last positive. I think there's a lack of experience, and again, coordinating does not necessarily, calling plays does not necessarily equate to being a great head coach, but lack of experience as a defensive coordinator, that's a big negative. I think he's only been a defensive coordinator for 3 years. I think looking at the numbers, you could make a very strong argument that if he was not working for somebody he went to college with, he probably would not still be the Lions defensive coordinator. They have been bottom 5 in third down defense and allowing touchdowns in the red zone every year he's been the coordinator. They have been bottom 5 in pass defense, which is weird for a guy who knows the secondary as well as he does. Every year he's been the coordinator. Their run defense has been good. They do produce some pressure, although they're not overly aggressive. Not a whole lot of blitzing. They only blitz 28% of the time on the average. Reading some message boards and reading some articles and things like that, fans use phrases like player regression across the board, lack of flexibility, lack of creativity, not putting players in a position to succeed, asking too much of players. Who does that sound like? There just isn't a lot to sink my teeth into, just like with Wilks. Not a lot, even though Wilks had a lot of experience coaching in the NFL. There's not a lot to sink my teeth into. The biggest job that he's had in terms of responsibility, coordinating a defense, I mean, it's rough, but you could make a strong argument that he has failed in that role. Their defense is not good, and it's something that's held them back. With as good as their offense has been, they can't stop anybody. They're allowing somewhere around 25 points a game, I think, in the time that he's been the head coach. They can't get off the field. They can't get off the field in the red zone on third down, and this is supposed to be his calling card. So I just don't know. I don't know what you hang on to, what you cling to as, yeah, he's our guy, when his greatest calling card is, I mean, at best a D, but probably an F on a report card over the last 3 years.
Mm-hmm. It feels like all the success, because, being with the Saints and their success, even as working in the secondary, that was the Sean Payton, Drew Brees era, and that defense stunk. So even though the team had success, he had nothing to do with that. And now he's with Detroit, where Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson and that offense is really carrying this team into the playoffs. His defense has been bad for 2 years, if not one of the worst defense, and now it's middle of the road at best. So, even though he was part of, even if you say he was a part of some successful organizations, even so, that offense carried both those teams when they had their success. And I know, again, another defensive guy, we don't want a defensive guy, but also with Aaron Glenn, that would concern me a lot, is that he's been in the NFL for a little bit and he does not have a big network. The big problem with Brandon Staley when he came on was he was in the NFL for a little bit. His network was very small. He couldn't bring on any real smart OCs or DCs or bring on anybody to help him in his staff. And the Chargers tried to help him out in that regard. But this is another guy, not a very good network. He's only been with a couple teams, and he doesn't have a wide net to cast if he was going to hire somebody.
I think you could make a very strong argument that Staley was ultimately crippled by his lack of a network.
Absolutely.
And that was maybe the teaching, the lack of flexibility, those are issues. But had he had more experienced coaches in the room to bounce ideas off of and maybe even take ideas from, had he not felt like he had to be the smartest guy in the room, he might still be here. And the lack of a network is a concern.
I'm surprised that wasn't, and I know we're not going back to Staley, but now that you're mentioning that, I'm surprised that wasn't more of a red flag in the interview process. But again, that's the Chargers thinking they are the smartest guys in the room. So as far as the negatives go, I mean, you guys spoke to it. The Lions have yet to be like a top 10 defense. And I mean, they don't have to be a top 10 defense, but I feel like when you're talking about a guy who has as much experience defensively as a player, understanding the game, and that kind of being his forte, that they would be hovering somewhere around there as opposed to middle of the league. I mean, you could argue the defense is the weakest link of all three phases of their team. Again, I think what this is only a second year as DC on the team, but he's gotten the Lions to at least middle of the league. But again, some of that has to do with the improvement of talent. So he could continue to grow over the course of the next couple of years. But at this point, there's not enough proof to like give the stamp of approval to ask him to come in and be your head coach. He needs a little bit more time on task.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's end it here. We got one more. And it is the Cowboys defensive coordinator, Dan Quinn.
So Quinn has been a longtime coach, I should say, in the NFL. He got his start, I believe, as a defensive quality control coach for the 49ers, was promoted to defensive line coach. Later was a defensive coordinator for a couple of years in Florida before coming to Seattle, becoming the defensive coordinator, led the Legion of Boom in 2013 and 2014, at a point during which they led the league in turnovers for a 2-year period. They were physical, aggressive, ball-hawking defense. We all know about the Legion of Boom. Built a fantastic secondary. They stopped the run. They stopped the pass. They got to the quarterback, and they turned the ball over. All things the Chargers struggle with mightily. Eventually got the head coaching job in Atlanta. Did some good things. They did make it to the Super Bowl in 2016, which I believe was his second or third year as the head coach. Had a 25-point lead in the second half of the Super Bowl. Seemed like they had it locked up, and they continued to pass the ball with a lead. And we all know what happened from there. Huge clock management issues, letting the Patriots come back to win a game that they had no business winning at that point. Those clock management issues, he said he learned from them. Those clock management issues continued to persist throughout his tenure as head coach of the Falcons until he was fired after the 2020 season. He landed in Dallas as the defensive coordinator, took over the worst defense in the NFL in terms of points allowed, yards allowed. I mean, they were bad across the board. They weren't forcing turnovers. They weren't getting to the quarterback. And his defense has, I believe, led the league in turnovers for the last 3 years running. He showed some adaptability with the Cowboys. They obviously drafted Micah Parsons, which makes it a lot easier to be adaptable and creative. But the fronts changed. He went from strictly a cover 3 defense with very little pressure to blitzing more, being more aggressive, playing more aggressive coverages, which led to a lot of turnovers. And he's turned some guys who nobody thought a whole lot of when they came out to being, kind of elite level defensive backs, very productive in terms of interceptions and flipping the field. I believe last year the Cowboys led the league in offensive drives that finished in touchdowns after a turnover, after the defense forced a turnover. So his defense has been fantastic the last 3 years. It's a big reason why they have been successful during the regular season in Dallas. While they had some struggles with Dak at quarterback, this is a guy who has had coaching experience. He went through some of those growing pains in terms of, the clock management issues. You'd hope he learned from them. You won't really know until you hire him. Highly respected. He's been around for a really long time, had success at multiple different levels, primarily as a defensive line coach and a defensive coordinator. And that's Dan Quinn for you.
Greg?
All right, so pains me to have to say good things about Dan Quinn because I really don't like him very much. Nothing personal. It's just not my jam. So he's made the most of high-level defensive unit in Dallas. There are a lot of very good players on that team. Some that, as Jamie mentioned, aren't household names, but when you blend those with all-world players, then you probably can get them to play a little bit above their heads. He's improved his situational play calling, so give him props for that. Some of this feels like his backhanded compliments, though. I'm sorry, because look at the freaking defense, man. It's kind of part of what my question is about him, but we'll get to that later. Players also seem to love him, current and past. There's almost all good things that you hear when players reference him. I like the fact that Jamie also mentioned this. He's not as cover 3 dependent. See him run a lot more man, but when you have the personnel to do that, it enables you to be able to call that and feel a little bit more comfortable with it. I think he still runs a base 4-man front. So taking that into consideration, but also knowing that most of the time the Chargers come out in nickel packages as base. That's still very good for players like a Joey Bosa and a Thule. Let's say Joey's still around. You're going to have them playing with their hands in the dirt more. So that's probably how they're best utilized. The free safety in this scheme is also key. So he won't be keen on just any old body as the last line of defense. So he understands that, you need to have like an athletic, smart, rangy player manning the deep portion of the field. So sorry, Alohi, you don't meet like 2 of those qualifications. And also, we don't know what or who the hell JT Woods is at this point. So Pippi Longstockings probably out of the picture. Tippy Longstocking, sorry, that's what I call it, not Pippi. Also, interestingly enough, I know that we don't really listen to Kaplan and crew, but I ran across a clip recently, and someone called him to ask him if he could connect with someone in the Chargers organization to convey how much Quinn wanted the Chargers job. Now, this is before the Seahawks job came available. And of course, he had to let him know that everyone in Chargers organization hates him. So there's really no one he can contact on his behalf. But what he also said was, interestingly enough, that the Chargers are an easy fix. They're just soft. An actual NFL coach who's looking for a head coaching job called outwardly the team soft. So take that into consideration. But I like the fact that he was honest about it, and it's good to hear an NFL coach tell the truth about it. So now you can stop thinking, everyone out there can stop thinking that this is just our opinion. A guy who coaches for a living came out and said it.
Yeah, the fact that he's a proven, we talked about how, Vrabel could build a culture and Ben Johnson's a creative play caller. This and Wilks and Glenn don't really have anything to hang your hat on. Dan Quinn is an incredible defensive coordinator. We know what you get with Dan Quinn. He is an unbelievable defensive coordinator, whether it was Seattle, Falcons, Dallas. He's done it for multiple franchises, and everything you guys have said is true. I'll add one more good thing about Quinn. Micah Parsons might go with him. He said in an interview, they were asking him about Dan Quinn getting head coaching interviews, and he said, Dan's my guy. If he leaves, maybe I'll go with him. You never know. So obviously a player's coach. I think he might have said that in jest. But Cowboys players have obviously openly expressed their love for Quinn. And getting Micah Parsons would be a huge bonus to add if Dan Quinn were to get a head coaching job. So I think that obviously that's not a done deal, and maybe he was just sticking up for his guy. But still, that'd be a nice little bonus.
Yeah, that'd be a nice bonus. I'm sure he wasn't serious, and there's no way Jerry's going to let him get away. But it's fun to dream.
Sure
Maybe
is.
we feel differently about Quinn if Parsons comes with him. But based on my expectations, I would say probably not going to happen. Um, in terms of negatives, I mean, his first tenure as a head coach was not great. He made some huge clock management and game management issues in the Super Bowl that hurt them badly. Um, the flip side to that is they were staying true to their identity. The bad side is they allowed the Patriots to hang around and work their way back into the game and eventually win the game. Um, he said after the Super Bowl that he learned from his mistakes, but he continued to make the same clock management mistakes. There was a stretch in the 2017 or 2018 season where they scored 36 plus points and didn't turn the ball over 3 weeks in a row, and they lost all 3 games because they couldn't hold a lead. And this defense, again, is supposed to be his calling card. And without elite talent, he has not been very effective as a defensive coordinator or a defensive play caller. So he did not build a very good defense in Atlanta. They were always middle of the road or worse. They didn't create turnovers. They were not disruptive. They had a hard time getting off the field. So I'm not sure what you hang your hat on aside from, well, he's been a head coach before and maybe he's learned from his mistakes. I agree they are soft. We've been saying that for a long time. It's nice to hear a coach say that. I don't know. There's just nothing exciting or interesting about him, and he feels like a pretty heavy consolation prize to me.
Yeah, he's a bad head coach, just in general. He went to the Super Bowl, but that Super Bowl he had Kyle Shanahan at offensive coordinator, and once Shanahan left, they were 24-29, and then in 2020 they had a bad stretch, and then in 2020 there was some stat about there was something else about it, but they after they went 0-5 in 2020, the players were not shy about voicing their displeasure for Dan Quinn as head coach. He was fired. He had always had inconsistent teams. They were plagued by the fourth quarter collapses. In 15, they started off 6-1. Then they lost their last 7-9. In 2016, they made the Super Bowl with Kyle Shanahan. That was a good season. In 17, they started off 3-3. And then they won a couple down the stretch. And then the last 3 years, they went 2-13 in their first 5 games of the season. In 2020, they became the first team in NFL history to lose after leading by 15 points or more during the fourth quarter in back-to-back games. It ultimately led to Dan Quinn's firing. He is a bad head coach. His clock management is terrible. His teams are inconsistent, and his team absolutely gave up on him in 2020. That is not a guy I want head coaching my football team. Defensive coordinator, maybe. Head coach, absolutely not. And hopefully goes to Seattle.
Please go to Seattle.
Yes.
Stop
Or
me
Las
if you guys
Vegas.
have heard. Either just, actually,
not the Chargers.
as far away from LA as possible. So if he does go to Vegas, cool, whatever. So stop me if you've heard this before. So defensive coordinator who successfully coaches top tier defensive unit and parlays that into a head coaching gig eventually finds himself the laughingstock of the league after historic postseason choke job. Too soon? No. For all the reasons that have already been mentioned, no. Probably a very good defensive coordinator, but even still, I think that's based on the level of talent that he's coaching. He feels like a front runner, a defensive front runner. The Cowboys have a very good defense that shows up in games where they're playing with a pretty significant lead, where they can pin their ears back and get after the QB. If you pay attention to them in some of the closer games, there are some lapses here and there. There's some communication issues. There's some questionable defensive calls. It gets a little sketchy. But when you can play fast and free and you've got teams dropping back 40 times a game to throw the ball, then it's a little bit easier to call defenses. But when, you've got a matchup where, everybody's keyed in and it may come down to the last possession, that defense isn't as dependable as you would think it would be. So with that being said, if you were talking about Quinn as a defensive coordinator, I'd be open to it. But also, who is he coaching? Because if you're talking about a team that has like some middling players or not necessarily fully equipped to run the type of defense that's being run in Dallas right now, then I might be out on him then too. I'm just not a fan of Dan Quinn. Probably a really nice guy. Unfortunately, I just don't want him coaching my team.
Amen.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, that does it. RJS asking, why are we doing this during the playoffs? We were busy during the week, but here we are. And thanks for joining us, everybody. We will have part 2 coming up very soon. And I don't have a date yet. We haven't even talked about it, but there's your top 5 and that, well, not top 5, but the first 5. And as you know,
Definitely not the top 5.
No, definitely not the top 5. Maybe one of those guys. Oh, 2. But
2.
anyway, sorry. Yeah, 2. We'll do this again. So for Jamie, Craig, I'm Garrett. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Snap it off, Craig.
Salute.